to this ACDI webinar. Just for those of you who don't know me or haven't seen my face, I'm Mark New and I'm Director of the African Climate and Development Initiative. This is one of our occasional webinars that we run through the year. And I'm fortunate to have two speakers from Just Share. They'll explain a bit more about Just Share when they talk, but Just Share is a activist not-for-profit that aims to drive responsible investment to support, particularly in climate change, but in other areas of sustainability, environmental and social governance. So our two speakers today, we have Robyn Hugo. So Robyn has been to Just Share for about a year now, but before that she will be at the CER, where she was a lot of work with regards to sort of the transition out of our coal-driven energy system in South Africa, with a lot of litigation in partnership with other NGOs. So Robyn's got quite a long track record in working in climate change litigation, climate change action, and she's now heading up the climate change theme here at Just Share. And then our second speaker is Emma Schuster, and she's the climate risk analyst at Just Share. She has a background in law, but has been working at Just Share since 2019 in terms of doing the risk that underpins a lot of Just Share's work. So that sort of taking up more of your time, I'm going to hand over to them, but just a bit of housekeeping to start with. I've been warned that there's quite a packed presentation, so we're not going to really try and take interruptions, or we're not going to allow interruptions as we go through the presentation, but please feel free to post questions in the chat. Claire and Michelle will be keeping tabs of those, and then we will also have time for questions at the end as well. So we'll try and get through the presentation in good enough time that there will be room for discussion at the end. So Robyn, I don't know who's starting off first, but over to the two of you.
I shall. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks, Mark. I'm Robyn, and Emma and I will be co-presenting to you on corporate climate action or lack thereof. Some of our other colleagues are here too, including Lorena Pasquini, whom many from ACDI will know. We've divided the agenda into 4 parts. So first, it's an introduction to shareholder activism and responsible investment. Then we're going to talk about ESG and corporate climate action, some of the pitfalls and traps in this area, and we'll conclude by focusing on South Africa. How do we compare to other countries, and what are some of the factors as we see them that are inhibiting meaningful climate action? As Mark said, we're going to be covering quite a lot of information in the next 45 minutes, so please could you keep your questions to the end. But first, who is Just Share? We are a 4-year-old non-profit shareholder activism organization, and the only organization in South Africa dedicated to using responsible investment and sustainable finance as mechanisms to advance social and environmental justice. So we believe that responsible investment is necessary to create a just, inclusive, and sustainable economy. And we use research, engagement, advocacy, and activism to drive urgent action to combat climate change and reduce inequality. Our climate work in particular aims to catalyze action in the South African financial sector, which contributes to a more inclusive, sustainable economy and to the achievement of the Paris Agreement's goals, which includes to make finance flows consistent with low emission and climate resilient. Please, Emma. Its key tenet, as espoused by Milton Friedman in the 1970s, is that the only social responsibility of business is to maximize profits for its shareholders. Stakeholder capitalism, by contrast, holds that the role of companies is to create long-term value for all of their stakeholders. So not just those with a financial interest in the company. That means workers, customers, society at large, including the environment. The idea of stakeholder capitalism first arose in the 1950s, but then lost out to the seductive force of the profit incentive. Its recent resurgence, due largely to pressure from civil society, is driven mostly by awareness of the climate crisis and in the aftermath of the coronavirus pandemic. It has become clear that the pure profit model cannot be a solution and, in fact, exacerbates and in many instances causes our social and environmental crises. What then is Just Share's role in this? This is the context in which we operate, an old shareholder-centric model that is waking up to stakeholder capitalism. Just Share and civil society more broadly play an important part in representing these non-financial interests. A major part of our work is interrogating and exposing the difference between what corporates say and what they actually do. We analyze companies using as much information as possible and then assess them and hold them accountable to the law, to the science, and to their own rhetoric. To do this, we rely heavily on companies' self-reporting, which is why disclosure is so critical in this area. We'll talk about that a bit later. But this also makes the job a bit difficult because companies are very careful with their public images and so are increasingly sophisticated in producing extremely long reports that say very little of substance, or worse, that mask damaging information. In addition to our direct engagement with companies, we also play an important role in informing, rallying, and organizing investors to take a more active role in driving climate action. The asset managers and owners are the real stewards of private capital, and with the right mandates can really shift company behavior. Whenever possible, we also use global developments to inform local analysis. Besides companies, we also work to inform and influence the regulatory landscape to ensure that they are taking account of broader interests and not only those that have their ear, enforcing existing requirements and generally creating a context that supports a just transition. Then finally, we play a public information role by making our research available, engaging with the media, presenting to corporate leaders and financial professionals, and in other fora like this one. That is us. We move now on to part 2. Emma will talk about ESG and corporate climate action.
Thank you, Robyn. So what is ESG? Our work is founded on the belief, as Robyn said, that responsible investment is necessary to drive and to create a more just and inclusive economy and to drive climate action. So this acronym ESG is the catch-all term for the means or the framework for implementing responsible investment. It's sort of used as a proxy for sustainability, although it's not exactly the same thing. Sustainability is the goal, but in order to start to take steps towards it, it's been broken into these 3 broad categories, right? Environmental, social, and governance factors. And this breakdown into more manageable metrics is how sustainability can then be practically integrated into business practices and into financial decision-making. An ESG analysis then allows stakeholders to assess the extent and nature of sustainability risks and opportunities that are presented by a particular company. So for example, investors can use ESG metrics to score companies and then make their investment decisions accordingly. And the risks that are being assessed here are those to the company itself, and then ideally also the risks that its operations pose to society more broadly. For example, the carbon emissions of a fossil fuel company. Although this second aspect is still far from being mainstream, the focus for now is still very much on the risks posed by ESG to the company's financial performance. And ESG began as a niche concept, but it really has exploded recently. as it's become obvious that the existential threats we are now facing are the result of centuries of ignoring the social and environmental impacts of economic growth. But ESG analysis is only a tool, it's not an end in itself. And the extent to which it actually contributes to achieving real-world outcomes, like the goals of the Paris Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals, depends very much on who's using the tool and how they're using it. And climate change is a really good example of the limited usefulness of separating the ES and G. It was traditionally classified as an environmental issue rather than a human rights and an economic issue. And this classification has severely limited people's ability to connect the dots between our economic systems and global heating, and to understand the extent to which tackling climate change requires dramatic changes in our economies. So the concept of the just transition captures the goal of transitioning our economies to be sustainable and low carbon, but without leaving behind the lives and livelihoods that still depend on the old systems. That's a social issue. How this process is managed by corporate decision makers is a governance issue. The point is that classifications are useful, but should never undermine the overall goal they're meant to serve. And by the way, when we say that ESG has exploded, we certainly don't want to give the impression that it's a widespread or robust practice yet. Integrated and sustainability reporting have a long history in South Africa, but this doesn't mean that companies are routinely providing concise, decision useful, and balanced information on the impact of their operations. ESG integration into investment decision-making by financial analysts is still very new, and we seldom see any evidence yet of it leading to meaningful changes in the real world. There's no official formal qualification for training for an ESG analyst, and responsible investment is not currently incorporated into the coursework of finance and business degrees. And as a result, it's pretty easy for anyone to call themselves an ESG expert, which many who do have very little experience or understanding of sustainability issues. And maybe there's someone in this audience that may be able to help address this worrying oversight. One of the three main objectives of the Paris Agreement is to make finance flows compatible with a transition to a low carbon economy. And if banks and other financial institutions continue to fund fossil fuels, it makes it increasingly unlikely that the Paris Agreement's other goals would be met. And the most recent IPCC report makes this abundantly clear. So that brings us to the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. It was established in 2015 by the Financial Stability Board to improve and increase reporting of climate-related financial information. Main objectives of the TCFD are first, to identify the information that companies need to report on, so that stakeholders can assess the companies on their risks and opportunities, climate-related, of course. And secondly, to provide some consistency in companies' climate disclosures so that we're able to compare them. In 2017, the task force released a set of very detailed recommendations, which essentially are a framework to help companies report usefully on climate risks and opportunities. The recommendations are extensive and include additional guidance for certain sectors, including the banking sector. But they cover four broad pillars: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And reporting that is aligned with the TCFD under these pillars is meant to give stakeholders a comprehensive idea of the particular company's approach to climate change. And while it's definitely not a perfect framework, and being aligned with the TCFD doesn't mean that reporting complies in full with all the recommendations, but it has shifted the global approach to climate reporting. The recommendations have been widely adopted and supported by governments, the corporate sector, and by civil society as the most useful of the climate risk disclosure frameworks. It's a rare example of these groups nearly agreeing on something. In South Africa, it's still completely voluntary to report according to the TCFD. However, all the major banks have now released at least one TCFD aligned report, largely due to pressure placed on them to do so by Just Share and other civil society. Also, 91 recently became the first South African asset manager to release a TCFD report. Sasol's done so for 2 years and will release its third one this year, also due to civil society activism. In fact, Sasol's first commitment to produce a TCFD report was in response to refusing to table our climate resolution in 2017. In its latest annual report, Exaro says that it aims to adopt the TCFD recommendations, as does Anglo American commit to aligning its disclosures with the TCFD. So we have seen a fairly strong increase in TCFD reporting in South Africa over the last few years, but it is still limited. And most of the reports still don't address the most important pillar of the TCFD, which is metrics and targets. The financial sector reports that they're still facing major barriers when it comes to comprehensive disclosures. They say that there's a lack of available data, especially Africa-specific data, and particularly on Scope 3. Scope 3 emissions, for those who don't know, are the indirect emissions in a company's value chain. So for banks, that means the emissions associated with the companies or projects that they invested in. It's another potential area for someone here possibly to investigate. And they also complain about a lack of established pathways to net zero for low carbon economies, about weak and inconsistent policy signals from government, and a lack of reliable ESG benchmarks. So the next question then is, what does corporate action look like on climate change, and what should it look like? And I'll hand back to Robyn for that.
Thanks, Emma. So besides signing up to various climate initiatives, of which there are numerous, what is it really that we expect from investors when it comes to climate action? There are 4 stages. Firstly, transparency or disclosure. As we said earlier, full disclosure is critical to being able to make decisions about a company. Investors, banks, and insurance companies use this information for financial decision-making, but they must also disclose their own information. They have their own stakeholders and shareholders who want to understand the climate risks they face and the opportunities available in the low carbon transition. With companies in the financial sector, what we look for primarily is, number 1, are their disclosures aligned with the TCFD? So have they started to report in terms of the recommendations, and are they moving towards more comprehensive reporting? Are they reporting on their Scope 3 or indirect emissions? So those are the emissions associated with the companies or projects that financial sector finances or in which they are invested. They're called financed emissions. Scope 3 emission disclosure is, for most companies in South Africa, a fairly new practice if they do it at all. The other thing we look for upfront is the company's governance. So who in the organization is qualified and responsible for making climate-related decisions? How are people at the highest level incentivized to drive transition in the organization, specifically by linking executive remuneration to climate change targets? And do the board directors have the competence required to manage this very difficult transition project? By competence, we're not just talking about credible climate qualifications, expertise, and/or experience. It's also about conflicts. Many directors of listed companies sit on multiple boards, which can create quite perverse incentives. An organization in the UK called DSMOG has recently published a report on climate conflicted directors from around the world, which is really highly recommended reading for those interested in this issue. You may also have heard in 2020, Just Share ran a campaign related to Standard Bank's board, almost half of which has ties to coal, oil, and gas companies, the worst culprits in contributing to the climate emergency. The upshot is that South Africa is still very much at this beginning stage of disclosure. The climate competence of boards is not yet being seriously addressed. So disclosure we think of as the first step, but it continues to be crucial throughout a company's path to decarbonization. Next are commitments. So after initial disclosures, companies should make commitments around the decarbonization of their operations if they are carbon intensive, or their portfolios if they are financial institutions, which may look like net zero by 2050 and or policies that exclude investing in or financing of fossil fuels, particularly new fossil fuel projects or expansion of existing assets. At a minimum, commitments should include both of these. In South Africa, we also see many high-level commitments from companies to be part of the transition and to net zero emissions specifically, a concept we'll discuss a bit later. All of the major banks, for example, have climate change positions and at least some form of fossil fuel-related policy or standard. Our analysis of 5 local banks, that's Standard, ABSA, Investec, FirstRand, and Nedbank, shows that the most common fossil fuel financing exclusions relate to coal-fired power generation plants and mining in protected areas. There are some exclusions for financing to entities whose thermal coal revenues exceed certain thresholds. Most policies refer to enhanced due diligence processes and compliance with host country national laws, regional and international law commitments. And then oil and gas prohibitions largely relates to the type or source of oil or gas. So Arctic oil and gas, or tar or oil sands, which are not exactly relevant for South African banks. So far, Nedbank is the leader on this. It is the only bank that already completely excludes funding coal-fired power and new oil and gas exploration, and is targeting zero fossil fuel exposure by 2045. Other banks have been far less ambitious, although we do want to mention that 99.97% of Investec shareholders voted in favor of a resolution drafted with Just Share support at Investec's AGM last week that requires the company to report on a strategy to reduce its Scope 3 emissions and on its short, medium, and long-term targets to reach net zero emissions and align with the Paris goals. So that is not only for its fossil fuel exposure, but throughout its portfolio. And Standard Bank, after refusing to table a resolution we co-filed, which asked for this specifically, has now committed to publishing a climate strategy and also to Paris-aligned short, medium, and long-term targets to reduce its exposure to fossil fuel assets. Both banks will have to do this next year. Next come transition plans and targets. After broad commitments, we then look for a company to lay out its plans and how it intends to reduce its emissions, which should have tangible, measurable targets, including short, medium, and long-term targets aligned with the latest climate science. You will know that the current science says that for net zero to happen by 2050, there will need to be 50% reduction in emissions by 2030 at the latest. So companies' interim targets must reflect this. And lastly, progress towards targets. We would then expect the company to report annually at least on its progress and any lack of progress towards achieving targets. We haven't got anywhere near to stages 3 and 4 in South Africa yet. We're still trying to wring out decent disclosures and commitments from our corporate sector. Now, all companies like to talk about the ESG journey, but frankly, we've left things far too late for a meandering trip. Disclosure is one thing, and that has improved significantly as a result of civil society pressure. In relation to climate change in particular, though, we need to see action, meaningful science-based strategies and emission reduction targets that will result in compliance with the Paris Agreement's goals. This will include meaningful exclusions in financial institutions' fossil fuel policies. ESG has gained so much momentum recently that, for better or worse, it is the system we have for driving responsible investment and climate action in the corporate sector. But this next section introduces a few of the darker sides of ESG. Back to you, Em.
Thanks, Robyn. Yes, the dark side indeed. Let's talk about greenwashing first. Harry Frankfurt from Princeton University released a book in 2005 called On Bullshit. In it, he says that bullshit is speech intended to persuade without regard for the truth. He says, while a liar cares about the truth and attempts to hide it, the bullshitter doesn't care if what they say is true or false, but rather only cares whether their listener is persuaded. There are lots and lots of initiatives and frameworks that are designed somehow to counter or prevent the negative outcomes of the shareholder capitalism model that Robyn mentioned earlier. Unfortunately, humans are extremely adaptable, and so for every bit of progress, it's been matched by equivalent developments in the scope and sophistication of greenwashing. Greenwashing is when a company purports to care about climate and environmental issues in its company reports, its PR material, by joining climate initiatives, and so on. But in reality, it continues with business as usual, focusing only on maximizing its profits. And this practice has become so sophisticated that it can be very difficult to know which companies and financial institutions are actually really trying to have a positive impact and which are simply making it look as if they do. In South Africa, this process is completely unregulated. Companies can say whatever they like. The private sector prefers self-regulation. And the National Treasury's green finance taxonomy is still in draft form, but it will introduce some boundaries to what can be labeled sustainable or green. In principle, this should lessen the scope for greenwashing. Unfortunately, there is still lots of wiggle room because corporates have dominated the drafting process. Treasury's view is that since corporates will be using the taxonomy, they should surely lead the process of writing it, which to us seems rather like the fox guarding the henhouse. And the starkest example of greenwashing is that in spite of thousands of corporate statements, initiatives, and commitments over the past decade, global greenhouse gas emissions continue to rise. Greenwashing is corporate bullshit that threatens our ability to tackle the already overwhelming challenge of limiting dangerous climate change. It turns all the hope and promise of these initiatives into spurious exercises. And that brings me to net zero. The explosion of net zero commitments by companies, cities, countries, emitters, financial institutions. Net zero means that by 2050, any emissions that can't be stemmed by clean technologies will have to be removed somehow, either through carbon capture and storage, soil, plant absorption, offsets, that kind of thing. At its best, as a concept, net zero has forced the corporate sector to think about sustainability differently. It brings the transition to the front of mind with a number and a date. And it's making the finance industry think about how financed companies are planning to participate in the transition and about their own role in that. But how much of this is bullshit? Unfortunately, despite the promise and the absolute necessity, by the way, of net zero by 2050, it's also the latest frontier in greenwashing. An Oxfam report recently said that governments are using it as a smokescreen to mask their continuation of dirty business as usual activities. The problem is that to actually be useful, the emphasis of net zero needs to be on the zero. Netting out of emissions is only a last resort for those that really can't be stopped. Unfortunately, companies tend to prefer the net part of it, depending on negative emission technologies that don't yet exist outside of highly experimental and prohibitively expensive forms, and on pretty elaborate models of net zero pathways that are designed by consultants with very little climate expertise. So in reality, it has this unintended effect of acting as a means of distraction for companies and governments, pushing action further out into the future and slowing down the urgent need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions now. And the finance industry uses it to justify continued financing of the companies responsible for driving up carbon emissions. This just needs to be watched really carefully so that it doesn't follow the history of initiatives starting out with the best of intentions, but eventually being co-opted into tools to cover up a lack of real action. Net zero commitments have to be accompanied by short-term real-world changes, including the required 50% reduction of emissions by 2030. Jonathan Foley from Project Drawdown has a list of actions that are expected of a meaningful net zero commitment. According to him, companies must cut their own emissions towards zero, not net zero, as quickly as possible. They must only use carbon removal as the last resort for truly unavoidable emissions. They must pay the social cost of carbon for ongoing emission pollution. And they mustn't stop there. They must address historic emissions too. And they must carefully weigh issues of climate justice in everything that the company does. What this list shows is that a vague commitment pushing action out to some distant date when today's corporate decision makers are simply not acceptable. And then I come to lobbying. This is the last one I'm talking about, although there are lots of other examples as well. There's a huge amount of direct climate change lobbying in South Africa by business and industry, but also much is indirect, like creating false narratives that put into question facts, science, and reality with the sole purpose of manipulating public opinion and stalling climate action. These narratives can be subtle, even seeming to be in support of climate action. One of the most successful of these has been to redirect the blame for climate change and therefore the responsibility to address it onto individuals. We've all heard it. We are all responsible for climate change. Ride your bicycle instead of taking your car, and don't forget your reusable shopping bags. Or this BP example on the slide, when BP tweeted for people to share their own pledges for reducing their emissions. And somebody retweeted it saying, I pledge not to spill 4.9 million barrels of oil into the Gulf of Mexico. This particular marketing plan spectacularly backfired. But in general, using narratives like these shift the responsibility onto individuals, which allows companies to avoid their own responsibility. And so this is an example of lobbying, even if we don't necessarily think about it as lobbying. Unlike some other countries, lobbying is also unregulated in South Africa, which makes it impossible to know exactly what's going on. What we do know is that some corporates have close access to influential decision makers, and particularly through their industry and associations, they have significant power to influence policy and legislation to be most favorable to their own interests. Earlier this year, we applied in terms of the Promotion of Access to Information Act to the Environment Department and the Mineral Resources and Energy Department, asking for a list of meetings between government and various corporates over a particular period. The DFFE gave us many pages in response, but the DMRE, after stalling for several months, claimed to have no such records. So either there are so many that they couldn't keep count, or they have zero record keeping, or they don't want to share that information with us. There's a think tank called Influence Map in the UK, which reports that South Africa's carbon tax regime is an example of how the corporate sector effectively took a promising piece of legislation and delayed and weakened it. Fossil fuel companies and the industry bodies that represent them are busy at work undermining the climate change regulatory regime, and more on this on the final section. So these are some of the things that we have to watch out for, but now we will hone in on South Africa.
Right, so how is South Africa doing? We've said throughout this presentation that the South African corporate sector is in the very early stages of climate action. When we started to work on climate risk in the financial sector in 2017, not a single South African bank had any fossil fuel financing policy, nor did any of them disclose how they were assessing and managing climate risk, if at all. Even institutional investors claiming to be responsible investors did not have climate change position statements and were not engaging with investee companies on climate risk in any meaningful way. Since then, well, we've talked about the 5 biggest banks now all having some fossil fuel financing policy. In the past 2 years, they have also all tabled climate risk-related shareholder resolutions at their respective AGMs. 5 of these were either filed or supported by Just Share or tabled following engagement with us. And every single one of those received extremely high levels of shareholder support, by the way. And all 5 banks have published at least one set of climate-related disclosures aligned with the TCFD recommendations. Sasol has acknowledged that its current business model, making fossil fuels from fossil fuels, is incompatible with a low carbon economy and is investigating various lower carbon options for its future. The company is undertaken to provide more detail on its plans in a 2050 roadmap at some point later this year, and to allow shareholders a non-binding vote on these plans at its November AGM. Following Standard Bank and Sasol's refusals to table shareholders' climate resolutions for a vote at their AGMs, we've obtained a legal opinion that confirms shareholders' rights to file, at the very least, non-binding disclosure-related climate risk resolutions. We recently co-filed, together with 3 asset manager shareholders, a non-binding climate risk-related resolution at Standard Bank. As mentioned earlier, although the bank refused to table the resolution, it responded by committing to report a strategy and targets to reduce its exposure to fossil fuel assets on a timeline aligned with the Paris Agreement, which was the request in the resolution. The bank then subsequently conceded and publicly acknowledged that it is not, in fact, opposed to shareholders proposing non-binding resolutions. We know this might sound more like a list of Just Share and other civil society achievements, but frankly, companies don't take action unless they push to do so. And these developments must be celebrated. But ultimately, we need, as I said, much more meaningful action. There's still significant resistance in the sector to take up the challenge to steward a genuine just transition, which is not to say that this is a uniquely South African problem. Around the world, lobbyists are preventing robust climate action at government level. The finance industry is still trying to squeeze the last of the profits to be had from fossil fuels, and many of the carbon majors are stubbornly sticking to their old business models. But even those bits of progress being made globally, including supporting and filing climate resolutions, reporting on these Scope 3 emissions, and disclosing plans and targets for decarbonization, still haven't reached our shores. What is it exactly that is preventing progress? A number of things as we see it. Firstly, really misguided narratives about equity and development. A common refrain goes like this: South Africa, as a developing nation, should not have to take ambitious measures to reduce its carbon emissions, at least not to the same extent as more developed countries. First world countries have had 2 centuries to develop on the back of exploiting fossil fuels, while Africa remains chronically underdeveloped, which is unfair. It is now our turn. And while it's undeniable that we suffer tremendous social ills in South Africa, this is certainly not down to a lack of exploitation of fossil fuels. South Africa is not the same as the rest of many other parts of Africa in that respect. In fact, in South Africa, we've been mining and producing fossil fuels for almost 200 years. And while Africa is responsible for less than 3% of global emissions, South Africa alone contributes about half of those. This gives us the dubious honor of being the 12th highest emitting country in the world, with the 38th largest per capita emissions. That, by the way, is higher than China's and India's and well above the global average. We also have the most carbon-intensive economy of the G20 at more than double the global average and the highest reliance on coal. What's more, South Africa is also one of a very few countries in the world that has both high per capita emissions and high levels of extreme poverty. You can clearly see there our outlier status on this graph. This demonstrates that we have systematically failed to convert our high emissions into improved living conditions for the vast majority of the population, thanks to pervasive and persistent economic structures that were established by the colonial and apartheid regimes. But for corporates unwilling to embrace the transition, this argument provides a convenient moral sounding escape clause. Even if they're not outright lying, it is at least bullshit, according to Frankfurt's definition. The other major barrier to progress in South Africa is a fairly weak and contradictory regulatory regime. In 2010, South Africa looked as if it would be quite progressive and bold in its intention to address climate change. However, its attempts have been delayed, undermined, and significantly weakened by concerted lobbying efforts, and a government that is disorganized, has been plagued by corruption, has significant vested interests in fossil fuel development, and is still disagreeing internally as to the best path for the country. For instance, the climate change bill was first conceived in 2010, but is yet to be enacted. The Carbon Tax Act was finally enacted in 2019, 9 years after it was originally mooted by National Treasury. That is 9 years of revenue that might have been put to further mitigation and adaptation efforts. And even now, it has so many caveats and concessions that its impact on the companies it is supposed to affect most is quite muted. Then government departments whose decisions have the biggest impact on climate change are fundamentally misaligned on their ideologies and approaches. Despite impressive sounding statements in government policy overseen by the Department of Environment, Forestry and Fisheries, and what seem like bold announcements by the president on the international stage, the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy, for example, appears completely committed to building new gas infrastructure and even still envisages new coal-fired power, despite this being neither least cost nor required for energy security. And then South Africa's latest draft nationally determined contribution in terms of the Paris Agreement is woefully insufficient, although it's an improvement on our current NDC. It has been assessed as being significantly too weak to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and does not constitute our fair share of responsibility. And finally, the JSE certainly proclaims its sustainability credentials. When it comes to action, however, it has not taken even some of the most basic steps required by the many grand global initiatives you can see on this slide, in which it plays a role. So far, the JSE has been reluctant even to recommend that JSE-listed companies report in terms of the TCFD. It has not aligned its own climate disclosures with these recommendations, nor has it even signed up to publicly support them. All of these factors contribute to an environment that perfectly suits companies, financial institutions, and investors that lack the will or the incentive to take strong climate action. So where does this leave us? Monday's IPCC physical science basis for the 6th assessment report confirms that even in the best case scenario of deep emission cuts, the world will reach 1.5 degrees of warming within 20 years. I think this example illustrates the problem quite well. At last week's AGM of 91, the first SA asset manager to sign up to the Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, we asked about its engagement with Sasol, which it describes as at a relatively early stage, and says that it is building an appropriate relationship with the company. We asked 91 which circumstances would trigger an escalation in its approach to engagement with Sasol, to one that moves beyond dialogue to concrete action to drive change that results in Sasol's strategy and emission reduction targets being aligned with the Paris Agreement. The CEO responded that 91 is perfectly happy with Sasol's approach and their management team. We're talking here about the world's self-proclaimed largest point source GHG emitter, which, while it has at least acknowledged, as I said, that its current business model is unsustainable, has not set any net zero targets. In fact, to date, Sasol has only set one GHG emission reduction target, to reduce its emissions by 10% by 2030, or for 2017 baseline, despite claiming to be committed to addressing climate risks since at least 2012. What is clear is that we need to keep up the pressure to drive the urgent adoption of strategies and targets that deliver positive climate outcomes soon enough to prevent the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Some small steps have been taken in the right direction, but we're some way from the giant leap required. We need to speed up the journey to a low carbon, sustainable, and inclusive economy and call out the delaying tactics, greenwashing, and other bullshit. Thank you. We're happy to take some questions.
Thanks, both of you. Thanks, Robyn. 15 minutes for questions. A couple of questions in the chat, but I think the one question that might be interesting for you to try and address was the one around whether there's any sort of system either internationally or locally for labeling different companies. So a bit like, your fridge is labeled in terms of its energy efficiency. Is anybody sort of working towards something along those lines that would allow either products or companies to be labeled in such a way?
I want to talk about your green finance taxonomy, Emma.
Yeah, and that is the purpose of the green finance taxonomy. It's very detailed, extensive, covers a lot of different aspects of products and financing initiatives, and particularly in the financial industry, what they can offer, what constitutes a green bond, for example, or the various green financial products that they offer. And I'm not sure about, I know Europe has many more of these kinds of things that extend to washing machines and plastic bottles, and I'm not sure about anything like that applies here, but the taxonomy is going to be used, it will extend into any further initiatives that take place as well. It will be the basis of any kind of labeling that happens thereafter.
Thanks. People, if you want to ask a question, just, sorry, Robyn, then just you hover the actions button at the bottom, and then you could just raise your hand. Otherwise, obviously, just keep putting questions in the text as well if you don't want people to hear your voice. Sorry, Robyn,
no, I was just going to say we've only participated in the last round of comments on the green finance taxonomy because, as Emma said, it was largely corporates who are involved in the drafting. Next is to come a transition taxonomy. So they separated out some activities that they recognize are not necessarily green, but may be required in the transition to a low carbon economy. But it would really be great to have more minds working on this stuff and providing inputs and comments.
Great, thanks. So, I mean, I posed a question about Nedbank, but I was just wondering if you said that nobody's really moved into action, if you like, in corporate South Africa. So how, I mean, what is who's furthest along the road? Is it somebody like Nedbank? So they've got a target, but do they have a strategy and kind of an action plan and a pathway? I just wondered who's,
we often ask,
as an example, if you like.
We often ask to do a kind of rating, and in fact, we're going to shortly be sending out a survey for asset managers to assess how they integrate or not climate risk into their decision making. So yes, of the big banks, as I say, I mean, already in 2017, Nedbank said this arose when government was planning 2 new independent coal-fired power stations, and all of the banks were on the hook to fund them. And Nedbank already then, didn't yet have a policy, but very, very quickly said, we will never fund coal-fired power. It doesn't matter what technology you use. It doesn't matter the size of the plant. It doesn't matter which jurisdiction it's in. So from that perspective, they've been a leader for a while. And now I posted a fairly recent, April, news post we did on our website about their new energy policy and their climate change position statement. So as Emma said, they're actually talking about zero fossil fuel exposure by 2045. So not net zero, and actually some meaningful exclusions. You can see them summarized in that post. Whereas many of the other banks have said we won't fund destruction of the Amazon. Great, that's fantastic. Or they've given examples that are not that are not particularly relevant, or they've overplayed how important fossil gas, for instance, is in the transition. So I'd say of the banks, Nedbank certainly got the best policy. And then that Investec resolution that passed last week is actually a pretty big deal, because it's not limited to only fossil fuel exposure, but they're going to set short, medium, and long-term targets across the entire portfolio to be aligned with net zero trajectory. So we will wait and see what that looks like. And then Standard Bank also, as I said, is going to do the same strategy and targets, but focusing only on fossil fuels. So yeah, that's where we're at with the banks. ABSA is the only bank that is yet to publish a fossil fuel financing policy. It's only got a coal one, and the oil and gas is coming next. They're doing it in sectors, but all the rest have dealt with all of the fossil fuels.
Andrew Gilder just asked a question about what you think in terms of initiatives like TCFD really sort of being mainstreamed in South Africa, I guess. You see that as inevitable, or is there kind of a job for organizations, I guess, like yourself to be pushing for it? Yeah.
You want to take that, Emma?
I would say it's not inevitable without people pushing for it. So a bit of both, but that it does seem to be going that way. Other jurisdictions have already mandated TCFD reporting for listed companies. The London Stock Exchange has done that. And unless something better comes along, then it will be the TCFD that is the one that they choose. According to the JSE's many statements and commitments, they're going to eventually have to do something. And I think our view is that it will probably start with something like this, making the TCFD aligned reporting mandatory for listed companies.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, it's really as we said, a pretty obvious opportunity for the JSE to take the lead, to require that JSE listed companies at the very least report in terms of the TCFD. So yes, we hope it will happen. It needs to happen, but we can't say when. So yes, certainly in response to that part of the question, we're going to have to keep up the pressure.
Thanks. And then just one question from Darlington Sabanda asking whether sort of the way ESG is set up in South Africa, whether how does it, and if so, in what way does it sort of address poverty and inequality reduction? And I guess that was sort of one of the other action areas that Just Share is interested in. So maybe you have some insights for us. So.
Maybe show that slide towards the beginning where or did we take it out in the end? That sort of tries to group the various factors into environmental, social, and governance. We may have taken it out in the end. She's smiling.
I think you took it out, yeah.
Damn. But yeah, I mean, that stuff is generally, those issues are generally regarded as falling under social issues. And of course, the sustainability development goals, many of the investors will align themselves with those. Yeah, Emma, help me out here.
Yeah, I think that's the core of it, is that it's broken down into these things, and social seems like the most obvious one to address poverty and inequality, but they're all connected. And so even within climate change, that's really an important aspect of climate action and climate change advocacy, because we want to not only not leave people behind, but also leverage up new opportunities to address some issues that it hasn't been possible to solve using old systems. So yeah, it's definitely the tool it has a role to play. It's important. It's connected to the Sustainable Development Goals. It's connected to South Africa's development plans. It's just a matter of how cleverly it's used and integrated into the decisions of companies.
And we will often in our advocacy and in our AGM questions, we focus a lot on wage inequality. So the difference between disclosing the gap between what the top earners in the company get, which stratospherically increases every year, and what the lowest paid earners are getting, because of course wealth inequality simply drives all the other forms.
And that falls technically under governance, because it's about executive and board remuneration.
If we have any of our other colleagues on the call, is Mel on? Or anyone else who's more knowledgeable, please help us. I don't see Mel.
Okay, doesn't look like they're there, or they've run away, or they're too shy to talk. I had one final question, which was just around whether you've done similar analysis with some of the big sort of pension fund managers, so an Old Mutual, or even like the public pension funds, and whether they are sort of heading in the same direction. I'm particularly interested in the public funds, because at the moment they seem to be the ones that are sort of supporting of the fossil fuel industry through the investments that they make. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear about those two different sort of groupings, which are obviously quite powerful in terms of the assets that they manage.
We'll just talk about that opinion and our plans, please. Emma?
Sorry, I got stuck for a second. I got my internet got stuck for a second, but I think you were asking about the pension funds. Is that right? Yeah. So in 2019, we commissioned an opinion about the responsibility or the requirement for the trustees of pension funds to take account of climate risk in their decision making, where they allocate their assets. And briefly, the finding is absolutely they are required to. Regulation 28 requires pension funds to take account of sustainability or ESG issues. And then this opinion was honing into whether climate risk specifically constitutes one of those obligations. And they found that it did. So that's pretty clear. And yes, they are the ones with the most power as well, although there seems to be a strange dynamic between the asset owners and the asset managers, in which asset owners aren't necessarily directing the decision making of the asset managers. The asset managers are given quite a broad mandate. Of course, that can change at any time. So ideally, it would, we would convince them that they need to take more interest in the allocation of their assets, and that they're actually required to do so. So that is clear. And in terms of the work that we do, we are engaging with them through letter writing and surveys to find out whether they've taken up our advice, which we publicized in 2019, and whether any action has been taken so far. And we'll be able to say more on that when we get all the responses and analyze them a bit.
Thanks, Emma. And yeah, Mark, you're right. Of course, the asset owners are really, as we said, they've got a lot of power. And when companies and financial institutions are sort of gambling about the transition and how much more time we have to exploit fossil fuels, they're really using our money, right? So when as the climate crisis intensifies and we have ever more extreme weather events, etc., stranded assets are piling up. It's our pension funds that are going to suffer the effects, not the bank accounts of the executives who are making those decisions for us. So that's a really crucial pressure point.
Unmute myself. We're sort of at the end of our allocated hour, so I'm going to bring it to an end, and thank both of you for giving up the time to do this, preparing the presentation. I know it's kind of your, you could probably talk about this for hours and hours because of your expertise, but still the effort involved in pulling it all together into a concise presentation is very, very much appreciated. And I'm sure that if anybody wants to follow up with you on particular things that they're interested in, they can get hold of you. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available through our YouTube channel, so people can have a look at it again. So without any further ado, thanks very much, and I guess good luck. I mean, and you're doing a really, really important job, and it was really nice to hear about some of the things that you've been doing and how you've really been influencing some of these important actors in the financial sector. So thank you very much for your time.